thinking and systems levers as a way to be thinking about strategy and what is the most effective for accelerating results. And I want to start, if you all will allow me, if we'll go to the second slide, by asking you to take a sheet of paper and answering this question. So the question is, how do you make toast? And just very quickly, about 1.5 minutes on a sheet of paper, quickly draw a diagram of how one makes toast. So draw me a diagram of how one makes toast. And I'm counting on your honor code that you'll actually do this and not just wait me out to show you examples. So just scribble something, nobody will see it. About another 30 seconds. Okay, so hopefully you have a diagram, no matter how sketchy it is, and I'm going to show you a set of diagrams on the next slide. So these are 6 examples of how other people, different than you, answered this question and drew this. And if you're interested in this exercise, you can look at the website that I list there, which includes a gallery of many, many more examples, but also Tom Wojcik's basic take on using the diagramming of how to make toast as a way into talking about systems change. But the thing I want you to notice about these 6 diagrams and your diagram is that they're all different, and that they are all, in a sense, abstractions of a process that is common enough that we can engage in it, but distinct enough that people have very different perspectives. And if you'll notice, in particular, there's one very, very simple diagram, which is the bottom middle, which is a person with a piece of bread over fire, right? And that is very different than the one in the upper right-hand corner, which begins with the wheat fields and goes all the way to eating. But the thing that all of these have in common is that they are abstractions of a process. And with the exception of the middle bottom one, they all include a process, right? And the middle bottom one could have included a process of gathering the wood, lighting the fire, finding a stick, extracting the bread from some container, et cetera, et cetera. They all have a process implicit, they're all abstractions, and they all, for the most part, embody a sequence. And so what does this have to do with systems thinking and systems change and system levers? The notion here is that a system, or thinking about a system, is itself an abstraction, right? A system doesn't exist per se. A system is a way of thinking about a set of interactions and a set of elements that interact with one another to create something larger than any of the elements. But it's an abstraction. It doesn't exist out there in a way that's tangible. We frame it. And the way we frame it, right, these 6 elements here are frames. The way we frame it is based on our assumptions, our preferences, our understanding, our perspective, right? If we were a farmer or a grocery store supply chain manager, we might have a very different perspective on toast. If we were a gluten-free eater, which many of you might be, you might have a different perspective on toast because you might actually be reading a lot of labels to look at getting gluten-free bread, etc. The point being, again, that assumptions and perspectives shape how we see particular systems. Let's go forward. So defining a system, and here I really rely on the work of Donella Meadows, who was a really important systems thinker in the United States. She died about 15, 20 years ago, but her work continues to really frame a lot of what folks in the systems thinking and complexity theory world, particularly in the US, do. So her definition of a system is that it's an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something, a function of, or purpose, or for our purposes, a result. So interconnected set of elements coherently organized in a way that achieves something. What I want you to be careful about as you look at this definition is this notion of coherently organized. Coherently organized doesn't mean that somebody sat down to design a system, although sometimes that is how it happens. But it is the notion that the parts work together for an end, whether they work together out of a tacit agreement, a set of tacit agreements, a set of traditions, a set of arrangements, or because somebody laid out a blueprint and built or tried to build a system. But the key pieces are the interconnected set of elements, and that they are an interconnected set of elements that work together to achieve something. All right, next slide. So systems and systems thinking are obviously related. Systems thinking is a way of thinking about systems. I know we're not supposed to use the words in the definition, but that is basically what it is. And here you have the Waters Foundation definition, which is that systems thinking utilizes habits, tools, and concepts to develop an understanding of the interdependent structures of dynamic systems. And the idea is that when individuals have a better understanding of systems, they are better able to identify the leverage points that lead to desired outcomes. So the key here, a couple keys here. One is this notion that systems are made up of interdependent structures, right? This is the elements that Donella Meadows is talking about, and that systems are dynamic. They don't stay the same. They change based on circumstances, based on people, based on context, based on happenings. And so it requires a certain kind of framing, right? The habits, tools, and concepts to be able to understand what's happening, because our common sense way of thinking about the world in the West is to think about it mechanistically and to think about it in more of a linear, technical way. And here the notion of interdependence and the notion of dynamism really shift what we have to be taking stock of. And then the second sentence in this definition is really, so what? It's like, well, this sounds very complicated. Why would I want to do that? And the hypothesis is that the more you understand the interdependent structures of dynamic systems, the better able you are to identify where to enter and where to push for change in a way that leads to desired outcomes. And we'll keep exploring that. This comes from the Waters Foundation, which is an amazing resource. Their mission is to spread systems thinking, particularly for school-aged children. And so they have tons of resources on how to infuse systems thinking into the curriculum, and you might find them useful. I think I give the web link in a later reference. All right, let's keep going. So you may have seen, if you're in the Strive world, a version of this iceberg. And the notion of the iceberg is a way to think about systems, and specifically this notion that often what we see when we think about systems are the events, right? Enrollment in the school system, graduation, the football game, the musical, right? The things that appear above the surface, the things that could be calendared, teacher hiring, teacher orientation, teacher firing, principal hiring, superintendent contracting, right? Those things that we can see as events or elements. It's the what happened. And oftentimes when people start systems change, they just go right for that, right? So if we could change who the superintendent is, or if we could change the buildings, or if we could change the classes, right? Just to think about changing things above the waterline, changing the obvious, creating programs, creating events. And that's helpful. There's a lot of learning that can happen in that. But in systems thinking and in systems theory, we think about the things that are underneath the surface that actually make for bigger leverage for change. And this is what we're going to be talking about for a little bit. So in this frame, There are patterns of behavior, right? What's been happening, what are the trends, what changes have occurred. So it's looking at the past and the present, and really thinking about not just events, but patterns, literally, themes, things that are repeated, things that occur more than once. And then below that is the inquiry into structures of the system. What's influencing those patterns? Specifically, like, what are the policies? What are the regulations? What are the protocols? What are the assessments? What are the physical structures? And what are the relationships among the parts? So you start to think about what's underneath, again, going to a further depth than patterns of behavior down to structure of the system. An example of this in the educational world would be the school day, right? The school day and the school calendar sets part of the structure, right? Class size sets part of the structure. Ratios of teachers and other adults to students is part of the structure. And then the lowest, deepest level, which ends up being the biggest leverage level, is the mental models, which are what are the assumptions, beliefs, and values that people hold about the system. In a way, it's what is the consensus about what the purpose is of the system. And a really profound example of a shift in mental model that we've seen over the last 30 years in the US is moving from a child care frame to an early childhood education frame. And it's many of the same actors. If you look at who was sort of providing this care and attention to young children 30 years ago, they were providing the care, and they're providing the care now, but they thought before that their job, they were organized as if their job was childcare, providing a safe place for children to be when their parents could not attend to them. Now, more of the mainstream has moved to that the role of that catchment of actors is to begin the child's education. And so the measures, the beliefs, the training, the purposes have shifted, and it's been a transition, right? I did a lot of local work in DC, and I remember when our system was making that transition, and it was challenging and controversial, and now it's taken for granted because a transition in mental model and system framing has happened. So the notion here is that if you're trying to work on the iceberg of the system, the deeper down you work, the more powerful the change. It's not often easy to go straight into the mental model level, but it is the most powerful work that can happen. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, let's go on, Michael. So one of the things to say is that we live in systems, but we don't always see them. If you've been around the Strive folks, you might have seen them use the person role system frame, and the person role system says, I'm a person, I'm Marian, I'm in a role. Right now, I'm in the role of webinar presenter and expert, and I'm functioning right now in a system that is the Strive network, right? And so as a person, I'm bringing myself to the role, which is very specific, which is this expert presenter, again, in the Strive network. It's not a role of coach and facilitator, which is the role that I'm more comfortable with, which is about question posing and activity and coaching. It is now presenting knowledge. So I am showing up in a way that is constrained by role and is also constrained by system, because I've done a version of this presentation for folks in the community development system, and you'll see some evidence of that later on. But right now I'm focusing on your system, which is a national network focusing on outcomes for children and youth, primarily focused in education, even though you do other work. So I'm shaping myself in the context of system. We exist in multiple systems, right? You see in the lower box, we have a well-being system, which is sort of how we manage ourselves, our health, our spiritual well-being, our physical well-being, our psychological well-being. We exist in a family system. We exist in a workplace system. We may exist either ourselves or through our children in a school system, and we exist in a community system. And those systems interact in ways that we may not be fully aware of, but that are real nonetheless. And when you are trying to make a change in education, and you are thinking about the changes that children and young people are experiencing, you may be all the way focused in on the school system, but they exist in these multiple systems. And one of the things about cross-sector work is how do we pay attention to the kind of connections within and between systems. And so that's potentially another place of leverage. We see this, for example, if you think about third grade reading and the third grade reading campaign, which is really thinking about the connection between school and family and some places community, because folks are introducing family literacy as a lever for shift in third grade reading. So that would be an example of crossing systems. And then there might be work with libraries or work with congregations that would be a crossing over into community systems. So strategies to move a result can work across systems, and we do that somewhat unconsciously and tacitly, and part of the work that we're trying to do today in talking about this is how do we make some of those assumptions about cross-system interactions more explicit. Okay, let's go on. So one of the reasons that we think about systems work and systems thinking, and that I find it so powerful, is because it becomes a corrective to cognitive bias. And you may be aware of cognitive bias, and if you're not, you should be, because it's really fun and you can impress people at parties, but also because it's a way of thinking about the kinds of errors that we make just run-of-the-mill every day because of the way that we're wired. And there's basically kind of 4 patterns of errors that we make. One is if we have too much information, we only notice changes, bizarreness, repetition, and confirmation. If we don't have enough meaning, we fill in the gaps. And we fill in the gaps with patterns and generalities and the benefit of the doubt, and we go to easier problems, or we go to our current mindset. And then there's the not having enough time. So we're looking to keep either shortcutting or assessing that we're right, that we can do this, that the nearest thing is best. Let's just finish what we've started, or keep our options open, or easier is better. Or we might not be able to manage, like, to have enough memory. So we save space by editing, generalizing, keeping an example very front of mind, or using external memory. These are all strategies for, in a sense, simplification. And we just do it on a daily basis without thinking and unconsciously. And when we're working in a systems context, our cognitive biases really can get us in a lot of trouble, because we won't see the whole, we won't see the interdependence, we won't see the functions across time. And so we will make errors, right? We'll say, oh, I have a youth violence problem and it's just too much. So you know what we're gonna do? We're going to just cut and do curfew, right? That would be an example of the too much information and not enough time bias coming together. So there are these shortcuts and these error patterns that we have in the way that we try to intervene in social issues that really are rooted not just in ideology or perspective, they're really processing errors. And systems thinking can help us mitigate some of those very common processing errors, because as individuals we bring the processing errors, but those processing errors in a way get multiplied and exponentially kind of grow when we are working with other people if we're not careful, because we reinforce each other's cognitive biases. So systems thinking, in my view, really can help us do better work together and do better thinking together. Next slide. Okay, so the Waters Foundation, which I mentioned before, has this wonderful frame of habits of a systems thinker, and if my math is correct, they've identified 14 habits of systems thinkers, and they have a great set of resources. They have this poster, they have some cards, they have a book about habits of systems thinking, and you can really kind of train your muscles in systems thinking. We don't have enough time to go through the 14. They are just one version of thinking about systems thinking, but I find them particularly useful because I can remember them because the pictures are pretty memorable. So I'm going to ask Michael to move to the first slide. So I'm only going to focus on 5 of them today because we don't have a lot of time. And I just want to kind of offer you like tapas of systems thinking for you to explore at a later time. So one of the most important kind of frames for system thinking, in my view, is the notion of seeking to understand the bigger picture. If you've been exposed at all to the adaptive leadership thinking, the first notion here is of, in a sense, literally here in this picture, taking a balcony view. And that when you do perspective, when you take perspective, when you look at the bigger picture, you can see more than what you would be seeing in your particular role. So you're taking, in a sense, elevation to have a broader view. And there are two kinds of ways of understanding the big picture. One is seeking the perspectives of others, right? I'm going to have interviews and focus groups with parents or teachers or students, kids who succeeded in this public system and kids who didn't, et cetera, et cetera. So you do perspective finding in a sense. But the other kind of form of that is what we see here in this balcony view drawing, which is perspective taking, like actually working to take the perspective of somebody who is more distant from or outside and trying to see the whole. In some work I do in the community development system, we often ask the question, what would, if a Martian came to your town, what would they say after walking around? What would they say are your community priorities? So seeking to understand the big picture, this is really critical. And one of the things we're doing today together on this webinar is actually engaging in this seeking to understand the big picture and trying to see the whole. The second kind of systems thinking skill or competency that I want to just lift up is this changing perspective to increase understanding. And this is, again, a form of perspective taking, so it's related to the first one, but it's really trying to, in a sense, puzzle out what's going on by shifting perspective and thinking, for example, if we back map versus if we forward map. If we think of this from the perspective of somebody who's transferring into our system, or if we think of this from the perspective of an auditor. So you're just like doing this perspective taking again, but it's multiple perspectives. It isn't just the big picture, right? If I'm the accountant, what am I paying attention to? If I'm a child with a disability, what am I paying attention to? That you're very carefully and specifically kind of running yourself through the system from the perspective of different folks. A very simple one of this might be if you're doing, again, in the adaptive leadership world, if you're doing the thinking politically exercises and you're thinking, what would a supporter of this policy argue and what would an opponent of this policy argue? And then you use that to define your strategy. So seeking to understand the big picture and changing perspective to increase understanding, two of our first five. Next slide. So another systems thinking skill is this recognizing that a system structure generates its behavior. It's not the only thing that generates behavior. There's culture, there's tradition, there's biases, but a system structure can generate its behavior. And here you see the wind, it's the same wind, the same current of air interacting differently with a kite versus a pinwheel, right? Same current of air having a different impact on the pinwheel and a different impact on the kite, right? So if we think about, for example, a school system that tracks students, college-bound, middle-level, vocational, remedial, that's a structure that's going to generate splitting, right? Tracking, literally, and may inadvertently reinforce biases, underestimate the capacities, cap the capacities of particular kids. The notion here of a structure that is a very large classroom in an open area would have an impact on the learning that can happen. So the notion of systems thinking when you're paying attention to system structure is that you're really trying to suss out the impact that the structure has on the behavior. I remember in child welfare, one of the issues that people would work on is how bad family visits were. And if you ever saw the rooms in those days that people were doing their family visits in and the way that they were being supervised, you'd be like, well, I would act out too if I was a child or even if I was a parent. And simply making the rooms where people were visiting with their children, where parents were visiting with their children, family friendly, had a huge impact on the behavior of the people who came for the visits, right? And it was sort of a duh when you thought about it from, you know, after you've done it, but it was really kind of a big innovation to shift the structure of the family meeting rooms. And it was a surprise to many people that it changed behavior. So structure and its relationship to behavior. On the right-hand side, top right-hand side, is the fourth one, which is identifying the circular nature of complex cause and effect relationships. And so I mentioned that our cultural pattern is to think about linear kind of billiard ball impacts. I hit A hits B, B hits C, etc. But there are different kinds of dynamic relationships, and one of them is the cycle, and really what we call causal loops or feedback loops or reinforcing loops, which is the idea that something I do or don't do can amplify the thing that I'm observing. An example of this could be truancy. Let's say that kids are truant, but I don't connect with the parent until the quarter is over. And that means the parent didn't get, I have a slow feedback loop. And so the parent can only intervene towards the second quarter. They have no ability to intervene in the first quarter. Very different than if I am tracking attendance on a weekly basis or even daily basis and communicating with parents. I'm shortening the feedback loop, and that's going to have an impact on behavior, right? So the circular nature of complex cause and effect relationships, like the notion that harsh discipline can exacerbate behavior is another example of a kind of complex cause and effect causal loop. So the ability, when thinking about why is this happening, to not just look at the straight billiard ball line, but to think about what are the other dynamics, the other reinforcing dynamics that might be here, that might not be linear, that might be circular, okay? And then the fifth one, which is the one that we're going to spend the most time on, the last half hour on, is this notion of using your understanding of system structure to identify possible leverage actions. And here you see somebody trying to lever, literally use a lever to lift up a rock that is too heavy for her or him to lift up on their own. So they're using a lever. If you've ever changed a tire, the jack is a lever. You're lifting something up that you couldn't lift yourself by using kind of force and leverage. And the reason this is so important is because systems are very complicated, and if you tried to change it one little part at a time, you couldn't do it. You'll be there forever, and you'll also create an enormous amount of chaos. So we want to think systematically about how to come into systems change in a way that magnifies and multiplies the impact in powerful and productive ways. So let me stop there. Questions, thoughts? And I know it's awkward because it's a webinar and it might as well be a podcast because I can't hear you. But let's see if there are questions or thoughts, including from some of the Strive folks. It was a very subtle hint to the Strive folks who are on yeah.
We will also just give folks, we know that it might take some people a little bit longer to type their questions in. So we'll go ahead and give you about 45 seconds
and I can
type
drink
in
some water.
Perfect, yes.
Multiple needs are being met. Thank you, Emily. So I will just vamp while we're seeing if there are any more questions before we move on slides. So we all do systems thinking all the time, right? If you cook, you're in a way doing systems thinking, right? You know, the way that you add ingredients, you know, the temperature, what pan you put them in, all of those things are kind of an example of systems thinking, but we just do it automatically. You know, when you're thinking, if you've ever kind of taken care of a kid, you know, there's a lot of systems thinking. I just gave the example of the family visit. So systems thinking is not something that's alien, but we may not be very aware of it. And yes, recognizing the structure is pretty related to identifying the circular nature, but some things, some of the impacts, part of the reason it gets pulled out separately is that some of the impacts in the circular nature don't happen inside the system. They may cross the boundary to other systems. So it's related but not collapsible. Great question. All right, let's go on. So this is a simplified version of the iceberg. Elements and events, we talked about, that's the stuff above the waterline. Here, these are the things we are most likely to notice, and the shocking and sad thing is that change efforts here have the least effect. And whenever I work with a group that already has a strategy, most often their work is pointed here, and they are very sad to learn that it is most effort for least gain. The middle level is what in the iceberg is separated as patterns of behavior and structures of system. And here they're collapsed into the category of interconnections. And changes here may greatly alter the system, right? And I want to just emphasize them may greatly alter the system because systems are tricky things and you never know. And so part of the piece around systems thinking is that you have to test. Because you don't know what will have an impact, because you can't fully see the system, you can't fully see the culture, the patterns of behavior, or the structure. So in a sense, you're testing to see what will create a cascade effect or what will create a powerful effect inside the system. And then the bottom one is the mental models piece that we were talking about. And these are the least obvious parts. The changes here can have a drastic or profound effect, and for good or for bad. They're the hardest to get to, but pretty powerful. All right, so let me see what's the next slide. Okay, let's come back. Erase it. So what I'm going to walk you through are Donella Meadows. You might remember her from one of the earlier slides. She was once in a meeting that was about an international trade agreement, and she was getting really annoyed with the conversation because she felt like it was completely off task and people were not really thinking in a systems way, and they were trying to affect international trade agreements and kind of get a more positive outcome for low-income people and small nations. And she just like rattled off something in her notes and then got up and put it on a flip chart, and she was really cranky. And it became this thing where people were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And she elaborated it into a newsletter article, and then it became a book, and then it has just sort of lived over the last 20, 30 years. I find it amazing and really, really helpful. So I'm going to walk you through the levers, and I'm going to try to give there are examples that I've built in, but they don't all come from education. And I'm going to see if we can together, through the awkward Zoom platform, come up with some examples. So I'm going to take you through the levers. And this was sort of her proposition of what I see the question, of what would make the most sense to lever change. So, and we have a question around changing patterns of behavior seems like a monumental feat, and how do you approach that? And the levers, I think 1 through 7, get at some of how we change behavior. Okay, so remember here we're going in descending order of strength, okay? So the first one is constants, parameters, and numbers. And the action is to change the numbers. So we've seen this as a change impact in child welfare and in juvenile justice. We're literally lowering the numbers that are coming in because you're doing a really good job at diversion, kind of changes sort of what the burden for the system is. Examples of this in the policy world are subsidies for clean energy, right? You can think about this in the education world where you might be working on the per student formula of funding from the state or from the county. Caps on campaign contributions also are an example of changing constant parameters and numbers. And this is literally like changing the numbers that create the architecture for a system. Changing the number of full-time equivalent counselors that you can have in a system if you're trying to change high school to college transition, effective transition. That would be an example of change the numbers. Number 11 is changing the size of the buffers and other stabilizing stocks relative to their flows. And this is something that we don't necessarily do in the social sector so much, but it's changing the size of the buffers up or down. Examples are just-in-time inventory strategy. It used to be that if you were manufacturing something, you would buy all the inventory for what you thought was going to be a year of production or 2 years of production. And then it was a big risk because you had to spend money on the inventory, you had to house the inventory, but now you can, because supply chains have changed and because of communications and delivery have changed, you can order inventory just as you need it. You could think about that as in school systems around supplies. You could also think about it in terms of cash reserves. Particularly, this is an issue for nonprofit organizations, sometimes for charter schools in the way that they work with the system. This tends to be one that we don't do so much in education. Number 10 is the structure of material stocks and flows and nodes of intersection. So this actually becomes important. The action here is redesigning material stocks and flows, but the other action is responding to changes in material stocks and flows. And so examples are sustainable forestry practices, like let's cut down the number of trees that are cut down, or only cut down trees in a certain way, or replace trees that are cut down. Energy retrofitting, trying to reduce the use of energy, but also population swells and declines. So we've seen this in the Midwest, in older industrial cities where you've lost population, but you have infrastructure, including educational infrastructure, from a much larger population. And then you're having to work with the material stocks and flows, which are enrollment. So if your enrollment numbers are going up or down because of population changes, that's going to have an impact on the system. In places like DC, where there are large-scale charter enterprises competing in some way with public school, the differential flow of students into one or the other system changes the dynamic in the broader educational system. So, for example, you could be working, let's say you were working in a Promise Neighborhoods setting, you might want set as a target increasing neighborhood retention in the local neighborhood school, right? Which would be increasing the quality of the school so that you attract more kids from the neighborhood so that you are able to do wraparound services. That would be an example of shifting the flow into a particular school. And so my sense of the leverage points for, somebody just asked about what are the biggest opportunities for partnerships to intervene and at what leverage points. I would say not in these. These sort of seem to me like more appropriate for experts than for cross-sector partnerships. Let's go on to the, let me see. I don't think it's important to understand the jargon. I think you want to basically be thinking about the ones on this page. You're wanting to be thinking about what are the resources, the inputs and the outputs that come into your system that matter, right? If we're losing population as a city, we probably aren't going to be able to be thinking about expanding the number of schools and building new schools, and then that becomes important. Holding on to enrollment in the public school system may be really important, and that is about stocks and flows. It doesn't matter if you call it that, but thinking not just about the what happens, but it's the like the programmatic pieces, but it's sort of who enters and who is in the system is important. And thinking about the financing and the cash flow areas, I think, is important if you're doing large scale system work, but might not be so important if you're doing neighborhood or community level work. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and here we start to get into the land of what can be, I think, productively tackled by cross-sector partnerships. And it's going to sound fancy language, and then I'll break it down. So the length of delays relative to the rate of system change. And here the action is to reduce or increase delays in feedback loops. And examples of this have been like a state qualifying people for multiple services based on one assessment, which means they don't have to be assessed multiple times. But it can also simply mean, like the example I gave you on truancy, how quickly do we get information? How quickly do we understand the impact we're having? So not to kind of rattle a controversial issue, but for example, assessments that happen once a year are a very slow feedback loop. And a lot of time has been lost. mini assessments in an ongoing way that are giving you feedback on how students are doing and how school climate is changing and all of that. That's a big leverage point for a system. It doesn't mean it's punitive in any way, but it's really just this notion of what's the feedback loop around how we're doing, where we're not doing well, and when we intervene. And that actually, I think, can be productively increasing transparency, and the rate of feedback loops can be a really powerful place for a partnership to work. Number 8 and 7 are basically the same thing, but one focuses on negative feedback loops and the other one focuses on positive feedback loops. So the number 8 is the strength of negative feedback loops relative to the impacts you're trying to correct against. And this would be regulating or deregulating negative feedback loops. Examples in the broader world are gasoline taxes that favor environmental impacts, or preventive medicine, or Freedom of Information Act. But an example, I think it's in Minnesota, would be a superintendent deciding that you can't suspend a child unless she okays it. And that would be really regulating the negative feedback loops. It's saying you can't use suspension, which is a negative feedback loop, so easily, and I'm going to create more hoops for you to do suspension. That would be an example of regulating the feedback loop. The gain, number 7, is the opposite in some sense. It's the gain around driving positive feedback loops. The action is to reduce or increase the gains from positive feedback loops, obviously. Examples of this are campaign finance reform laws or the disruption of monopolies. An example in school world and education world would be not right now in many cities, the resources tend to go to the higher performing schools, right? So that's a way in which success to the successful, right? The higher performing schools are successful, and so they're seen as the place to invest. So we put our better teachers or our more experienced teachers there, and that creates this positive feedback loop that gets reinforced. And positive feedback loop just means it amplifies something, right? So in this sense, it's amplifying resources coming to a place where resources often go. Redistributing resources would be an example of intervening at the positive feedback loop. An example of this, which hopefully I won't mangle too much, occurs to me from Portland, where parents were raising additional resources for the schools where their children were. And that was a success to the successful loop in which parent-raised resources were significantly changing the educational opportunities kids in better off schools had. Then you create a foundation, all the money that is raised goes in there and it gets distributed equitably. That would be an example around disrupting the success to the successful and really adjusting the positive feedback loop. These are all 3 areas where you could see a partnership really intervening. Next. Can we do the next one? Right. Okay, so the first 2 sets were really at the pattern level, and now we start to get into the structure. So here we go. The structure of information flows, and this is who does and does not have access to information. And the action here is to improve or limit information flows. And in many ways, when you as partnerships start to work on the report cards, that is the leverage point of information flows. You're building greater transparency and then introducing the opportunity for accountability, because you're collecting, collating, curating information in a way that's going to allow it to flow intelligibly to a much broader audience that then is participating in assessment and accountability conversations about the school system. Has a big, big, big impact. And I've seen several of the partnerships work on information flows sort of beyond the report card structure, where you might be looking at which high schools are sending students who complete their first and second year of college versus high schools who may be enrolling, but kids are dropping out, right? You're sort of increasing the level of transparency and changing what people know about performance. That's an example of leveraging information flows. Rules of the system, and this is about incentives, punishments, or constraints. And this is the action here is to change the rules. Examples of that in the broader world are seatbelt laws, carbon offset frameworks. in your world, it could be ending social graduation, for example, was a big emphasis in changing the rules. Changing the rules around disciplinary action would be another. Changing the rules around the qualification of staff. This is something that happened when I was talking about the early childhood development to early childhood education transition. One of the things that happened was that the rules of the system changed. The qualifications for the people who worked in those programs changed, and that was an example of shifting the rules of the system to drive an outcome. And this is another area where a cross-sector partnership could bring a lot of leverage to shift and change the rules. Number 4 is the power to add, change, evolve, or self-organize system structure. And the actions here are enabling or preventing self-organization. Examples here are impact of social media platforms and their effect on labor organizing, crowdsourcing. But you could imagine, for example, a partnership enabling or facilitating parent organizing. That would be an example of leveraging system structure. You could imagine, as it started to happen, some charter schools unionizing, for good or for bad, doesn't matter, but it's an example of starting to shift the structure. So evolving or self-organizing the system structure is a really big lever, right? When people went to the small academies, that's an example of self-organizing inside the larger system. In a way, the whole charter movement is an example of this lever, where you opened up the space, society opened up the space to allow self-organizing of new schools and new institutions. That's a dramatic change. It's also a dramatic rules change as well. Let's go on to the last one. And these are the powerhouse ones. The goals of the system, shifting the goals of the system, changing the goals of the system. We're gonna go to the moon, President Kennedy's moonshot goal, or privatization is another one. The example of universal pre-K is a really powerful example of this leverage point. All of a sudden, the goal of the system is to provide universal pre-K. It's not just to open the doors at kindergarten. You've changed the dynamic. If you say, as some schools have and some districts have, now every child has to have an after high school plan to graduate, that's a shifting of the goals of the system. So that's a big leverage point, and you can imagine that a partnership could have big impact here with its political clout. Number 2 is shifting the mindset or the paradigm out of which a system arises and working to see the system as a whole, to changing the paradigm. Those are the actions you'd be doing there. And it's really important to kind of keep in mind where paradigms have already changed in the past in your community, right? Or in the larger world. A big example of this that we often use when talking about systems thinking is smoking in public, which went from being cool when I was a child to being highly regulated now. In the environmental world, it's going from dominion to stewardship. In education, I think it can be the change from aiming for graduation to aiming for a meaningful graduation that includes a job pathway and or college, right? So really shifting, even for example, the idea of college isn't for everyone, it's only for the few, to college is for the many. That's an example of shifting the mindset or the paradigm. And then finally is the power to transcend paradigms. And transcend paradigms doesn't often happen, but it's sort of the holy grail. An example of this in the education world is the massive open online courses, the MOOCs. It's also, I think we're seeing it in the entry of individualized learning and technology-assisted learning. We're starting to think about what is a curriculum, who is a teacher, how does a course of study get constructed, and that's beginning to change. And that's a huge leverage point because in a sense it resets the table. So those are the leverage points, the 12 leverage points. I think the first 6 to 8 are probably the most powerful places that partnerships can address and are addressing through their work. I want to pause and open for questions or comments. So the question is, how do you think about inside system strategies and or outside mobilization advocacy system strategies? And how can partnership take on roles in both, recognizing many traditional leadership tables are often comprised of inside system players? So I think that for any of these, you need an inside, outside, top down, bottom up kind of set of players in different levels. What I would say is that if we think about the taking multiple perspectives and taking the big picture as the system thinking competencies, that you can get to those by engaging across the inside-outside game, right? Like that what really wins the day at the end of the day is some combination of an inside-outside game and ratios that are particular to your community. And I think that the question about inside system players and who is sufficient to make change is that you need some dissatisfaction, right? Because if all of the somebodies that are at the table are inside the system and maintaining the system and happy with the system, then nothing is going to change. You need a critical mass or a critical set of connections of people who get a sense that what we're doing isn't enough and really are willing to look at business as usual to move it. And the question is, what do you start with and where can you go? And that's sort of part of the experimentation. Where could we go for detailed case studies on any of these leverage points? I think we would go to PARV's to-do list because they actually don't exist. But I think it actually would be a wonderful thing. As I was preparing for this, I thought it would be really cool to generate a list of examples and maybe even analyze, and I would invite you to think about this, is to analyze your own strategies using some of the tools that I've laid out here and see what you see about where the gaps are. When we do this with groups, we see that they are very surprised at what they're doing. And then often they sort of are like, wow, we are really avoiding what we know is the powerful thing. And Alex is saying that number 5, talking about unintended consequences and impacts. Yeah. Yep. So one of the things I want to say about systems change is that you really don't know what you're going to get. Meaning, because you're blind, so that like maybe you see 5%, 10%, 20%, on a good day, 30%. So you don't know what's going to happen once you start to move things. And that's why we talk about a bias to action and experimentation. So the way that we've been doing systems change in this country for the last 20, 30 years is that, not what you're doing, but maybe what a public system would do, is that we write up, we bring consultants, they tell us what's wrong, and we have like 50 actions we're going to take, and then we go take it. And that just shocks the system and freezes the system in some sense, and it doesn't really work. That it's the notion of building an idea about how the system is working, getting to some shared consensus and trying some things, and then getting the system signals back would be an example. I'll give you an example of unintended consequences or intended consequences from the child welfare system. You start to work on prevention, less kids are coming into care. You also start to increase family placement, so you need less foster homes. Then agencies who depend on foster homes, because that's the money-making part of the system, start to fight, and they actually are pushing up against the closing, the kind of moving away from traditional foster care as a strategy. That would be an example of unintended consequences or intended consequences that people didn't fully think through. You could have an example, I think, in a sense, we didn't understand what the kind of 3 strikes you're out approach to discipline would do, or bringing in, changing the rules by bringing in more police presence in school systems, and what that would, the impact that criminalization would have on students would be another example of unintended consequences. So part of the systems thinking strategy is actually thinking about these unintended consequences and kind of playing them out and trying to see them slowly. As a former recovering funder, how could partnerships use systems thinking with local and national investors who may be interested in more programmatic strategies? I think the thing about the programmatic strategies is for you as an actor, trying to think about what's the so what. So I put together this tutoring program or this early intervention on reading difficulties program. what's going to be left behind when this is over? Who learned something? What new rules did we change? What new knowledge got created? So what I would say is that even when you're working on programs, to really try to keep an eye on the system learning and the system gain that could be leveraged out of the programmatic strategies. So investors might allow you to test some of your ideas. So the programmatic strategies, if in the best case scenario, would be coming out of your understanding of the system change you're trying to advance. And I think we're at the end of time. Not the end of all time, but the end of today's time. Michael, do you want to?
We are, yeah. Thank you so much, Marianne. We did have one, I don't know if you got to it, but we did have one in the chat box just for another example of transcending the paradigm. I think that gets to
I would think about the individualized learning as a frame for transcending the paradigm, or even think about co-op work life credit, right? When we're thinking about how do we link work experience to learning would be an example, right? So externships, internships as a way of completing high school or college credit. That's a way of lowering the boundary between the real world and the classroom, and getting that built in a way to recognize that in a formal educational system would be an example of transcending the paradigm.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As Parv mentioned, we'd love to hear from you on these, some of the ways that you might be working with strategies and some of these leverage points. And if you have any questions or follow-up from this webinar, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We will make sure we get you connected with the right people. And we just want to thank you again, Marianne. This was awesome to have you join us. We are very appreciative and feel very grateful.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.